Good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science, bringing you the book series. I'm the Associate Director of Community Engagement, and I also teach in the Chicano Studies, Central American Studies, and African American Studies Department. Today we have Aaron Burke from the Near Eastern Language and Cultures Department, and his new book is entitled The Amorites and the Bronze Age Near East, The Making of Regional Identity. Hi, Aaron. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Celia. Thank you for having me.
We're very excited. So let's get started. Can you start us off with telling us what is the main argument and contribution of the book?
Yeah, well, this book is a sort of an outgrowth of, I don't know, more than 15 years of research in this field, and was one that I was particularly interested in when I sort of studied the period known as the Middle Bronze Age or Old Babylonian period between about 2000 and 1500 BC. And in this period, scholars running from Mesopotamia all the way to Egypt continued to encounter this group known as the Amorites, whether in textual sources and then sort of by construction and reconstruction in archaeological remains. And what we found was sort of different scholars, whether coming at it from textual or archaeological methods or historiographical methods, all had their own take on this phenomenon of this identity group. And I guess in some sense, it's such an enduring identity that it resembles perhaps labels like the Greeks or the Phoenicians. So it has a kind of resonance in these labels that are attached to groups that span, incredible geographic range and temporal range. And so as I looked at the problem and was working on it over the years, having dibble dabbled in, as I'm a Near Eastern archaeologist, but having dibble dabbled in Assyriological textual studies, biblical textual studies, archaeology and textual sources for Egypt, and seeing the way that different scholars were dealing with the subject, I was highly intrigued to see whether or not, if one sort of devoted time to the study of this particular group, could start to unpack what we mean by Amorite identity, and maybe more importantly, what was meant in antiquity. And in the long run, what I find is that the question is an evolving one, such that no single answer really can be given over the long term or over to either a specific group in an exceedingly narrow range, but rather it had to be compartmentalized to see sort of the evolving picture of this group. So I hope that ultimately folks will, scholars will really appreciate efforts to unpack this sort of complex picture that comes from a variety of different angles, be it textual sources, archaeological, iconographic, even ranging from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. And, just to sort of put it in brass tacks, many people might not know that they actually know an Amorite in their historical studies. And I always throw out there and remind folks that Hammurabi is your most famous Amorite in world history. And we all know Hammurabi because of his purported law code, which is a collection of laws that he advanced in the 18th century BC. And it turns out that this was not just something advanced by him as an Amorite king, but a number of Amorite kings and even some non-Amorite kings advanced these legal traditions. And they're sort of part of a broader set of cultural contributions that could be put, as I would suggest, under a cultural banner or an identity banner, more specifically, as Amorites. So that's sort of what inspired the project. And then I, had to sort of work towards dividing it into meaningful periods of time that would allow me to unpack this evolving picture over the course of 1,000 years, going back to the earliest references around 2500 BC down to about 1500 BC. So that's how it got started.
Absolutely, and all that complexity absolutely comes through. So, in that kind of line of thinking, how do the Amorites challenge traditional notions of identity, and why is this important?
In the last 20 to 25 years, both in classical studies and in ancient Near Eastern studies, and more broadly in archaeology in general, there's been a great interest in trying to get at identity in the archaeological record. We began in the 20th century really with sort of fixations on ethnicity per se. And I think it's become clear over the last 15 years or so, that this is not really a label that we can get at archaeologically, largely because it is associated with textual sources and a characterization of groups from one side or a characterization of themselves from the other, largely with, I'd almost say political, certainly political overtones, goals in mind in antiquity. And we as archaeologists have asked ourselves, is this really how we should be approaching the question of identity in antiquity? Do our concerns that come out of the post-Enlightenment research environment that has led to archaeological and historical studies really direct our understanding of identity in antiquity in the most accurate and helpful way? And the long and the short of it is no, not really. What one recognizes is that in the absence of hard national boundaries in antiquity, much more fluid boundaries. That's not to say that, at different times, different rulers didn't have an idea of where the border was, but these boundaries were much more fluid to the actors involved. That meant that these identities don't compartmentalize in sort of simplistic ways that we tend to approach identity today, because we're working within a political framework very often. And I think that we can definitely see in the modern time a kind of transcending of boundaries when we talk about identity groups and actors, whether we're talking about social, economic, or political levels of our analysis. We definitely see those transcending of these kind of categories. But we're often inclined, towards these simpler and more commonly understood terminology like ethnicity, even race, both of which are not very accurate for the ancient world. It's not to say that you can't impose those kind of categories on those discussions, but you have to qualify then what you're talking about. And what we find for something like Amorite identity, to sort of make it extremely tangible, is that we have a lot of different tribal identities under a banner, a broader banner that comes together as sort of an Amorite identity. That's not to say that people didn't have disagreements about characterizing or being characterized as Amorite in one moment or another. To go back to our friend Hammurabi, he's a classic example of someone who took a bunch of labels. He was the king of the four corners, a classic sort of ruler of all of the known world in his mind, king of this and king of that, king of the Amorites. And so, just in deploying those labels, he's clearly pitching to different groups and different labels that people may have been invoking. But the fluidity to the whole concept of identity, especially as one rolls through time from the mid-3rd millennium to the mid-2nd millennium BC, one sees a dynamic of constant change, such that it's sort of like trying to pin the tail on the donkey, except the donkey's moving too. So it's fun, in fact, to try to look at what dynamics are behind that. And that's sort of what the book ended up spending most of its energy on, is trying to track those dynamics.
Wonderful. So you have, as you have mentioned, a nuanced account. So can you tell us how your analysis accounts for nuanced understandings of Amorites not formed before?
Yeah, this is a classic example of standing on the shoulders of giants, I guess you could say. The field had so much work up to this point on this subject in sort of an atomized way, as I was alluding to earlier, where scholars who do linguistic studies studied the terminology and names that are distinctly Amorite. Some scholars would study the presence of Asiatics as Egyptian scholars translate the term over in Egypt, and not recognizing that they were talking often about the same phenomena. So in approaching it, I started to look at these sort of major episodes, as scholars very often did themselves, but looking them rather than, say, as a single book in and of themselves, looking at them as chapters within a book. Now, to be honest, I think someone could write a book about every one of these episodes, but the idea was to track across time the institutional and cultural mechanisms that may have contributed to the evolving sense of that social identity. To give an example, and I think this is perhaps one of the things that the work does out of bringing those former analyses together in a new way, climate took a particularly important role in it. And when I began the study, I had no idea where it was really going to go. This is truly a study where I began just following breadcrumbs and looking at the big picture, trying to be brave and maybe a little naive at the same time, stepping into different scholarly courts from Mesopotamia to Egypt. And as I looked at it, one could start to see some broad patterns of dynamic shifts, and looking at some recent scholarship over the last 20 plus years on climate change, notice that there are these kind of incidental events that come together to cause a moment of change that if you're looking maybe only at the textual references, you won't see, because there's no explicit reference to the fact that these individuals experience these changes. They simply did what they needed to do to adapt under certain circumstances. So in particular, I'm referring to an event that is often called the 4.2 kiloyear, meaning 4,200 years ago event. And this event is actually what defines globally our current environmental regime. It's called the Megalion. We entered a period called the Megalion. And at that moment, there were some dynamic changes in global climate, not always so exaggerated, but in marginal areas like the ancient Near East, where we have limited rainfall that's being exploited for pasture land, there was a huge contraction as a result of aridification. And through my own estimates and estimates of other scholars, we can tell that more than, or somewhere in the ballpark of about 500,000 people were put at risk within the arc of the Fertile Crescent in these marginal communities that had moved out there to exploit these pasture lands over the course of the third millennium. They'd been there for hundreds of years at the point that this took place around 2200 BC. And they suddenly were compelled to pick up tent stakes, or really in this case, to abandon whole large villages and towns and move to more humid environments. That would automatically, mean that they had to adjust their lifestyles. And scholars in the past had assumed, because of sort of tropes and common expressions about Amorites as shepherds and as nomads, which become kind of ubiquitous almost, and they are even invoked by people like Hammurabi because he was a shepherd of his people. So you can see, it goes right up until Christian times with Jesus and portrayals of Jesus as a shepherd. So this notion of the ruler as shepherd might be one way in which vestiges of these memories became attached to the concept of a shepherd in Amorite tradition. However, when these folks moved, they couldn't simply take their existing lifestyle and move it into dense and already occupied territories. You can't just simply move herds of animals into areas where agricultural land or other pastoralism is already happening and simply make a shift. And so abandoning the idea that these individuals remained in all cases pastoralists, I started to look around at other trend lines. And what I discovered was, in the late third millennium, as this is going on and as the Akkadian Empire is collapsing, we have a rise in military service by outsiders in different political regimes, whether in Egypt or in southern Mesopotamia in the last couple hundred years of the third millennium, in the wake of this grand exodus from these from this climate circumstances and this aridification. And what's fascinating is you see a shift of individuals into this sort of military realm, and eventually an ascension in political rank that contributed to the rise of dynasties such as Hammurabi's dynasty. And so it's interesting to see what you could study in a kind of atomized way, looking at Amorite names in the late third millennium serving within the existing Ur-3 dynasty before Amorites rule. You might look at it and say, well, that's really interesting. But the real interesting thing is to track from the end of that period to the rise of Amorite ruling and rulership over the course of 100, 150 years. And because of the way historians, tend to fragment history into clear and distinct periods, we miss these transitions, and we often don't ask ourselves, how do we get from the end of that to the beginning of this, when in scholarly terms, we're talking about 50 or 100 years, which is next to nothing in the grand scheme of ancient historical frameworks. And yet, those are the pivotal questions to ask and the challenges to overcome.
Yes, thank you so much. And I can tell that there's so many folks that are going to learn from this book, even outside of this discipline, as identity continues to be something we grapple in modern contemporary time. So in closing, tell us, how does your account of this group tell us about groups today? And more importantly, why students and faculty should assign this book?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the aside from the issue of just how complex identity is, I think it is a sort of first maybe experiment within many, of trying to grapple with what terminology we should attach to questions of what I would call more broadly collective identity. When we're trying to talk about groups of people, what do we mean when we use the labels, and how do individuals themselves intend those labels to function? And I hope for all the for all the reasons that scholars have shied away in antiquity of using terms like ethnicity or race, for very good reasons, shied away from using those terms, that we'll start to think about things in terms of social identities and the mechanisms that construct and lead to those identities. How is it that individuals come to be identified by others and may themselves take on terms to label themselves as actors on a sort of political, economic, and social stage? I hope it helps us move in a direction of asking those kind of questions, and also looking at, perhaps one of the things that I often talk about in my classes in terms of identity is resilience. One sees over the course of 1,000 years a kind of resilient and dynamic way in which identity is brought into service for a group to create cohesion at times, and other times to create clear distinctions and boundaries. So that one looks at the Amorite world, and as much as there is a pretty large geographic region of individuals, now these are mixed areas, it's not as if everybody living in that area is Amorite, but that as one looks at these large areas like this, one can see ways in which groups are working to find where they have similarities and create a common dialogue across categories of interaction, whether in the world of ritual dynamics and temple construction and equivalences between their deities in this polytheistic world, or even on a political realm, where competition and emulation become part and parcel of the dynamics. How do you keep that from just being reflected in warfare, for example, which was certainly a part of the Middle Bronze Age world of Amorites? How do you create a dialogue for treaties and the formation of treaties and finding middle ground? And that was actually also a part. They even have very distinctive rituals that they seem to have invoked across a large region that surrounded the way that treaty dynamics were created. So I hope that it will sort of get us to start thinking about, outside of our tidy constructions of how we envision identity, and see that this is a dynamic, constantly fluid environment. And yet, while it is, individuals are doing things to intentionally signal their identity and construct identity, and to allow them to transcend those differences, whether it's in the realm of cosmopolitan elites who are finding ways across community boundaries, whether it's social questions, equity and justice that find a sort of resonance among others. These are the things that sort of transcend these boundaries. And as much as we live in a world of national boundaries, perhaps this can give us some sense of thinking in ways that create a more cohesive society across modern boundaries.
Thank you so much, Aaron. We really appreciate your time. Again, the book is The Amorites and the Bronze Age Near East, The Making of a Regional Identity. So please make sure to pick up your copy. This is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science, and we will catch you next time.